So hi, all you Zen people. I am Bob Lopez-Hanshaw. I'm a choir director for a couple of ensembles at Temple Emmanuel in Tucson and the University of Arizona Faculty Staff Choir and Camerata Sonora and, whatever else is happening. I'm a composer, primarily choral, but also different ensembles. And the piece that we're talking about for this is called Vokas, Animo, which is for orchestra and chorus. And that was commissioned for the Tucson Symphony Orchestra and chorus that was based on a poem by the famous Esperanto poet William Auld. So I've been working on this piece. They formally approached me about the commission in late 2018. And then we all signed the contracts and stuff in March of 2019, and it's been nonstop work on it since then. I had to get the parts and score into the orchestra in August and September for the choral piano score and the orchestral score, respectively. And there's been rehearsing on that pretty much continuously since that time. The choir began rehearsing in early October, and with some breaks, we've had 12 weeks of rehearsal. I've been at almost every one of those. And the orchestra spent the last week in several rehearsals with and without the choir on this piece, and it was finally performed on this past Friday and Sunday, January 24th and 26th. And so now I'm recovering. It's Monday. I'm at my favorite coffee shop. It's quite a time.
Yeah.
Quite a time.
I didn't know the piece had orchestra, too.
Oh, you're absolutely right. It has an orchestra, and the difference in the amount of rehearsal time that they each had is remarkable and is indicative of pretty standard practices with most orchestras that feature a choir. is that they have a choir master that prepares that ensemble for months ahead of a particular program. And so they don't usually feature a choral work on all concerts in the season, usually only 2 or 3 at the most.
So did you have to teach the orchestra microtones?
In a sense, yes. The orchestra was a completely different animal than the choir in that respect. I've been working for the past over a year now, since after I was formally approached for the commission, but before we actually nailed it down in the contract. That's when I started reaching out to different microtonalists, instrumentalists specifically, starting with the woodwinds and the brass, but extending to all the instruments in the standard orchestra, as well as some auxiliaries like guitar and recorder. I reached out to these people to see what kinds of resources they had developed for 72, as far as like fingering charts. The first person to get back to me with any complete kind of chart was Robin Hayward on the tuba. And he's been fantastic through this whole process. He's, been doing a lot of work already on doing really fine microtonality on the tuba. He's in fact developed a particular tubing length system for the valves of a 6-valve tuba that can get subharmonics up to the 512th or something like that subharmonic. In the process of doing that, he also worked with Mark Sabat. This is really ridiculous of me, but I'm going to just sit down on the floor here.
Okay.
In this cafe.
I can't see you, so that's not ridiculous at all.
It's ridiculous to the people around me, but what do they know?
Yeah, they don't know anything.
Oh, man, they're going to see me just literally sitting under a table, acting stupid. Okay, but this is much more comfortable. My phone cord is too short and the chair is too high, so we're going to sit on the floor.
Okay, sounds good.
I've been a kindergarten teacher, so this is not news.
Yeah. So, you wrote an article recently on New Music Box about this choir piece and the act of preparing it, and how you would teach choirs to sing microtonal intervals. I really like how you bring the right priorities to the table, and you're talking about how you need to get the choir to like what you're doing, and you need to get them to focus on a few simple intervals. You talk about a target-based approach. Can you give more details about how that would work? Like if you were teaching a microtonal passage in a choir and aiming for a target.
Oh, yeah. I'm glad you asked. That's my favorite thing about this whole thing.
Me too.
Because teaching choirs microtonal music, teaching choirs any music, you rely on a set of internalized categories that training helps to make it explicit, right?
Yes.
Everybody internalizes them to some degree or another when they grow up in a culture that has a certain type of music. And in our culture, it's 12 equal, and it's, the various intervals that are constructed out of 12 equal, and mostly arranged in a major or minor scale pattern. And so most, whoever off the street can hear if something's not in the prevailing scale, because that's sort of the basic set of categories that they've acquired. And then musicians, as we get training, we learn to label those intervals, we learn to reproduce those intervals on command, but still usually focusing on the major and minor scale patterns. And it's more advanced, mental technology to be able to sing chromatic intervals. You have to sort of learn new tricks to do that. You go to school for that.
Yeah.
Microtonality puts a whole new layer on top of that. And the way that you can begin to introduce microtonality is in a choir is if you start from categories that they know.
Yes.
And it's so the thing that kind of led me to have this insight was actually Jacob Collier, and I linked to his video in my article, in my second article, the sequel, where he talks about hyperchromatic voice leading, or I don't know if he calls it hyperchromatic, but I'm going to call it that because that's what Kyle Gann calls it, and I like that.
Yeah.
Where you take, and what you have is, in his example, a minor third, and you sing, you start at pitch 1 of the minor third, and then you descend over the course of, I think he did 5 pitches, to the lower note of the minor third, and it's to harmonize, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. So here he goes, join in any reindeer games. And I clustered my pitches toward the top right there, but you get the idea. And if I practiced it a couple times, I'd be able to even them out more. But
no.
Yeah, you can do as many as you want.
I think I did 6, didn't I?
Yeah, you did 6.
Darn it.
So, hey, nobody's perfect, you know what? But the fact that we can pull out that stuff and it's not a problem for us, like, we don't even have to think about it. We can sing these microtonal pitches that span a minor third, and the minor third is fine.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That's because that is a super easy, already acquired category for us. And so when you're talking about doing this with choral singers, you have to find as many of those things as you possibly can, in order that if they get off track during the intervening stuff, then they can snap back on track, and half of the piece is going to be solid in the first place. What I experienced in teaching the piece initially was that, so there's a lot of quarter tone motion in my piece.
Yeah.
A lot of splitting a semitone into 2 quarter tones. And at first, they tried to sing each interval. They tried to sing a quarter tone and then a quarter tone, which, first of all, they don't know what that is yet, so it's not going to work. And second of all, if you try to do that, because it occupies the same kind of mental category as a semitone at first, i.e. a semitone is like the smallest thing you can sing, quote unquote.
No.
They tend to make them too large. They tend to make the quarter tones look more like semitones. Yes. And so they overshoot and overshoot and overshoot. And that happened in the beginning of this rehearsal process because though I was present for rehearsals, was not actually the one doing the rehearsals. That was Dr. Bruce Chamberlain, who's the choir master for the Tucson Symphony Chorus. And so while he gave me input, he did not, appropriately so, he did not, say, hey, how should we run this rehearsal? Like, what's the rehearsal plan? He's a great choral director, and he was going to run it how he's going to run it, right?
Yeah.
But it became clear rapidly that this is what people do with that, when you just, even when they hear it and then try to sing it back, they map it as they hear it to the existing categories of like a semitone, right? Or a semitone-ish thing. And so they're unable to reproduce what they just heard because they're thinking of it in terms of categories that they already know. Now, how do you hack that? Well, eventually, a couple of rehearsals in, I was able to sort of articulate this strategy where for those, splitting the semitone moments, then you need to think to the semitone.
Yeah.
You think of the beginning tone and you think of the ending tone, and that is familiar, and then you just put something in the middle. Yes. And eventually the choir was able to agree on what that middle thing is with the aid of the rehearsal piano, which was retuned, and then we go from there.
Yeah, Johnny Reinhardt actually talked about that in our Nouns and episode as well. Splitting an interval in half if you've already got it.
Yeah, the critical thing is that when you split an interval in half, you have to think to the interval. You cannot think of the intervening tones, at least not at first.
Right, and then later you sort of get that ability. I think it has to do with how people aren't used to hearing microtones, and then after they can hear those as legitimate steps in their own right, then it's easier to do something like sing a quarter tone.
Very much so. And you know what's fascinating? In my synagogue choir, sometimes we sing some stuff that has like chromatic change of leading tones or whatever, right? Yeah. Going up or down. Just normal chromatics. And some of the singers have a real hard time with that too. And so I had to take this target-based approach for that too, and say, sing the outer interval and just put stuff in between.
Yes.
So these are untrained singers trying to sing chromatic lines, and you would think, oh, well, people should know how to sing 12 equal, but they don't.
Right. It's a lot of it is so dependent on what they're expecting and how they're able to visualize what they're doing.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
What I've found about the target-based approach is that it's extremely, extremely useful for all kinds of singers, especially in warm-ups. I think maybe we were talking about when I played Aaron Johnson's Alleluia at Ball State, and we were doing warm-ups in 17-tone equal temperament, where we alternated the different kinds of steps. What do you think about using guide tracks? Do you think that they're too much of a robotic aid, or they don't really... I don't know, maybe they don't really foster a sense of, like, individual ear training, but maybe that doesn't even matter. I don't know.
Well, look, when you're doing something like the Chrysalid Requiem, that is superhuman.
Right,
I mean,
right.
it's the same level of complexity as, like, you know, Ben Johnson's 7th String Quartet. I mean, it's up there at the limits of what it's possible for a human to even imagine in terms of pitch patterns, you know, much less execute. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
So, yeah, you're going to want whatever aid you can possibly get for that. And even with the guide tracks, and even with, like, an intensive multi-track recording process, it was still an enormous challenge to get the Chrysalid Requiem off the ground. I've read some accounts of, like, the people who were involved in that, and it's, frankly, it seems like it must have been a nightmare.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I think what we need now is repertoire that does not require guide tracks, right?
That would be fantastic, yeah.
And obviously the 17-tone Alleluia is one of those. That's a thing at the Hakens-Fokker organization. And I was talking to Melevators about that.
Yes.
But what they do is they always sing with the Fokker organ, and what they get is rehearsal tracks to listen to ahead of time with their part played on the Fokker organ. So that's related, you know, but that's the type of repertoire. So that's like something like Henk Bading's Contrasten, which is something that I also mentioned in the article, where he uses one, it's like 3-4 pieces and or movements, and he uses one overtone series or undertone series for each piece. For each movement, and it manipulates it melodically and harmonically. And so if you learn the categories of that series, which is like harmonics 8 through 16, in each person's octave, then you can perform that piece. And as far as I know, it's only been done in concert with the Fokker organ, because he used like a 31-tone mapping for each of those harmonics.
I see.
But so that's the type of repertoire that we need, is stuff where it is not necessary to have a guide track. Because here's the thing, is that choral directors, they're not used to using electronics in the music making that they do, and it feels different as a musical experience to incorporate electronics, and that scares them off of modern repertoire that calls for it. And so I think the solution is not necessarily to try and force like a normalization of ever more electronics in the choral ecosystem, but rather to create repertoire, in our case, you know, microtonal repertoire, but for anybody, modern repertoire that does not require these sort of extra things, that can seamlessly integrate as much as possible into the standard choral experience. And that is the way to increase the acceptance of microtonality in the mainstream, is to create a repertoire that's a stepping stone into it, you know? And I think that's what my piece, that was definitely the goal of my piece, even though the system behind it was very complex.
Yes, that's an accomplishment, because it feels like to me if I were to write something microtonal for a choir, which I'm trying to do, I would think to myself, oh, well, I'm just going to have to write a bunch of things stepwise to make it easy. And maybe even then they just won't do it. So I'm wondering how you transcend those limitations in your writing, even though you're using techniques where you're making it easy for people to sing by having them imagine targets that they know.
That's the thing. I wrote to that approach. I used the ancient Greek enharmonic scale, or I guess you could say the Phrygian mode of the enharmonic tetrachord. Da, 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 da.
Oh, okay.
So basically you have two perfect fourth tetrachords, one on the tonic, one on the fifth, and within that tetrachord, from the top note to the next lowest note, you have a major third, and then you have a quarter tone and another quarter tone.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. So that's like one of the characteristic sort of ancient Greek theoretical modes that there was a lot of interest in the Renaissance, and like somebody like Vicentino took that as his stepping stone to making his own microtonal madrigals, what we would now call microtonal madrigals, and then that's what that one French composer did in his oratorio or whatever it was, Prométhée enchaîné. Which it was like 1840s, and it had its premiere delayed by like a year or 2 years because the strings just could not handle the quarter tones that were in the introduction to one of the movements, and they were doing literally that scale. There's been a lot of sort of neoclassical interest in Europe across the centuries about that scale. So I thought, okay, that's easy, and it sounds freaking good. And Harry Parch used it in his studies on ancient Greek scales. One of the movements was in that one. Arictas in harmonic or something, he called it. So that's like the melodic material that we're using, because it's easy to grasp by the ear. It's got these two half steps that are split by a quarter tone, and then you can move around it, and it's got a very distinctive feel to that thing. It's got its personality, and it's also like there's not a lot that's Zen about it, but the Zen stuff that is there is really apparent. So I thought, oh great, that's like that's my cheat. So I used that as the melodic material, and then for harmonic material that I gave the choir, what I ended up doing was giving them just like three things, right? Number one, sonorities that they are familiar with, major and minor chords, and like perfect fourth plus major second sonorities and stuff like that they're used to. Except that sometimes it's on a quarter tonal root, and the way that I got to the quarter tonal root was by quarter tonal voice leading. So for example, I have them in a perfect fourth, and then they resolve inward the perfect fourth by a quarter tone each to make a major third. It's super neat, and it's a very surprising moment in the piece. And,
oh my god! So, I just realized that movement that you talk about in our next episode of Now in Zen, which features a 41-tone guitar, Aaron Wolf discusses that exact maneuver.
Cool.
Yeah, it's cool. I think it's becoming a microtonal trope.
Well, good on it, because it sounds very surprising and yet familiar at the same time.
Yeah.
My techniques that I used with the choir were, number one, familiar sonorities, but perhaps in unfamiliar places. Number two, quarter tonal voice leading, which like quarter tonal and pseudo quarter tonal voice leading, because, for example, I used the 7-9-11 sonority quite a bit, which sounds like an augmented chord, simultaneously a really weirdly tuned augmented chord, and also a very stable augmented chord compared to the 12th equal augmented chord that you may be used to.
Yes.
And how I get to that chord is through steps of either a quarter tone or a sixth tone, because we're tuning it where, like, for example, your 11th harmonic would be a quarter tone up from a 12th head pitch, and your 7th harmonic would be a 6th tone down from a 12th head pitch, and your middle tone could stay the same. Your 9 could stay the same. So it's easy to get to if you start from the major chord that leads to it from the motion that I described. And then if you resolve from it also by a pseudo quarter tone type of movement, then each line makes sense, and it does that same da da da, that same melodic split that they're used to, but like in the incidental chord also makes sense. So that's number two, is how I got them to sing these exotic sonorities, was I made sure to utilize the same device as they were learning melodically. And then the third thing for the harmonic writing for the choir was incidental sonorities through highly melodic counterpoint. So each voice would be singing something very distinctive using that scale material, and it was enough where they were able to be part independent so that the verticalities just happened and we didn't have to tune them. Those were the three strategies.
So this is the approach that you talk about in your article, where you're approaching things in a, quote, bimodal way. You have to get them to understand how things are working vertically and horizontally.
Absolutely. And that's something that I'm sure I did not invent, that it's something that I had to articulate in this way for microtonal writing specifically, because there's no, for a lot of this microtonal writing, the horizontal step is super weird, but the resultant verticality is not. And there's a great tension between those two things if you're not, like, looking for it.
Right, yeah. Really love the idea of using target-based destinations as not only a pedagogical tool for people who are learning how to sing microtonally, but also as or part of a definition of, like, what it means to be Zen harmonic, or at least I've always thought of that. Like, if you are thinking about where a certain passage arrives and you compare that note to your original note, not only are you sort of invoking regular temperament theory, but you're also creating, like, a conflict maybe in terms of how something moves horizontally and vertically. And then the more that conflicts with 12-tone equal temperament, the more Zen harmonic something might be.
Well, if you publish it anywhere, I'll cite you in my 72-tone book.
Okay, yeah, I'm worried it's only a matter of time before other people figure that out, like, more than I will, so I have to hurry up and do it. Credit for inventing it or whatever. But yeah.
I think that something that gets overlooked a lot is that choirs, basically, most of the time, choral singers know two things. They know the major scale and the minor scale. And they know when you change to a different tonic. I mean, like, ideally, if they have insight into the piece, then they know when you change to a different tonic. And what they're doing when sight reading or when performing the piece is they are singing the major scale or the minor scale again and again in different orders with different tonics. And every scale tone has its own identity, and if they hit that scale tone, then it will fit into the surroundings. That's the philosophy that's at play, which is fascinating because, as we know, as Zen harmonic musicians, every scale tone can have 2 or 3 different roles even within a tonal context, and will have to be tuned differently in each of those roles. And so part of the target-based approach is instilling an understanding of that fact, that you're not, like, that if, say, you're in C major and you sing a C to a D, that you need to know where to put that D, because it's going to be different whether you're in the 5 chord or in the minor 2 chord. Or perhaps a better example, a more clear example would be A, because A, if you have a high version of A, then it's in tune the D, as a perfect fifth, and then if you have a low version of A, it's in tune with the F for an F major. And yet, for choral singers, they are in, like, a piece in C major and they sing an A, they just sing the 6th degree of the scale, and that's it. That's the category. And it just will fit if it's in tune to that scale. So it's this fuzzy notion of what the place is of each tone of the scale. So you have to instill the notion of both greater specificity and of greater flexibility and of knowing what it bodily feels like to be singing the 3rd of a chord versus the 5th or versus the root or the 7th or the 9th or whatever you're on. You have to have this very clear sort of bodily resonance, and that's something that Matthew, W.A. Matthew, talks about in his harmonic experience. It's kind of the crux of that book is embodying the tuning of these different roles that each note has. And, like, you can go from there into, like, comma motion and syntonic comma. That's what Ross Duffin goes into in his sort of guide to Renaissance just intonation practice. But at the more visceral level, which would be more appropriate for most choirs, then it's all about having a distinct feeling for where you land in a sonority that goes beyond what your scale tone is. And that's kind of, like, really what I mean by bimodal. Is mode 1 is horizontally, what's your scale degree or your altered scale degree, and mode 2 is what is the feeling of your place in the resultant harmony.
Yeah, I think it's that second thing that is really hard to teach in a microtonal setting to people who are unfamiliar.
Yeah.
You taught the 7-9-11 chord, I know, horizontally by using voice leading with quarter tones so that things were easy. But then, was there ever a time where you held the 7-9-11 chord to make sure it was in tune? And how did you sort of like check that with the choir? Like, how do you get a choir to realize when a 7-9-11 chord is in tune or not?
Well, you simply play it on the tuned Yamaha with bit clavier, and then you play it on the Baldwin or whatever they had in the rehearsal room, just the acoustic piano as an augmented chord, and you'll hear how profoundly different those two sound.
So you're directly comparing those two sounds.
Well, yes, because I need them to know what to not feel like.
Yes.
So you compare those two sounds and have them listen and go, oh, wow, you really? Yeah, okay. and then you have them do it again from the voice leading, and you play, the retuned Yamaha simultaneously with them and reinforce what that needs to be. And it's a process. You do it repeatedly, right? So they'll get in the ballpark with the quarter tonal voice leading if they already have a decent feeling of how to do quarter tones, and then they have to have like a tuning reference to how that should feel when they land. I
know that you're coming up with a book with 72 tone fingerings for each of the instruments.
That's correct. The collaborators in Europe and on the East Coast and in California, and there was somebody in Australia at one point, but they couldn't do it, and in like Belgium. We now have assembled almost a collection. I'm just waiting on a couple more people. And what I did once I had those was I sent them with the author's permission to the various players in the Tucson Symphony who would be playing my piece, and started consulting with some of them about what needs to happen on their instrument, what is the limitation that I should be writing to. The harp, the tuba, and to some extent the horn were the ones that I really focused on.
Yeah.
Kind of because I had access to those people mostly, but I also had friends in the string section. And let me tell you, it helps to have friends in the orchestra.
Yes, I can imagine.
Something like this. Because we could talk all day long about it, and they were invested in success and all the stuff like that. They were kind of my ears on the ground. But yeah, I consulted with many of the players before I even wrote the piece, and kind of used their input to guide what I was able to do, in addition to what's on the chart. And then in the final parts of the orchestral piece, I put down suggested fingerings for the tones that they were playing, and the caveat that not all those fingerings will work for your instrument, but that most of them will. And like, here's what you do if it doesn't work, right?
Yeah.
Which is usually try to either find out your own fingering for that note against a tuner, or figure out something with the lip. There was this big gap in between turning in the parts and like talking to most people about it, although I still talk to some in this gap, turning in the parts in the fall, and then now here in January, like, they get the parts 2 weeks before, the strings get them 2 weeks before to put in the bowings. The winds get them, I don't know, maybe 2 weeks before. I wasn't clear on that, but didn't really start working on it until about a week before the performance. And then we have the rehearsal process for the performance itself, which is like, I was lucky enough to actually have scheduled 3 rehearsals for it. 2 with the choir and 1 just the orchestra. I ended up getting bumped from the one that was just the orchestra because they spent too much time working on one of the other pieces. But I was still lucky enough to have 2 entire rehearsals, which I understand is not necessarily that common for an orchestra. Right. Compare that to 12 rehearsals that I had with the choir over 3 months.
Yeah.
And again, you see this difference in culture.
Yes.
During those orchestral rehearsals last week, again, unusually, the conductor allowed me to take the stand for a lot of the time, and not, actually conduct, but at least say, okay, in this measure, let me hear this section. Okay, now we all agree on that note. Let me add this section, and then we tune that unison, and then you add the sections together, and then, rinse and repeat to clean up the more unusual sonorities, like the 7/9/11s,
yes.
In the orchestra. Well, Maestro Gomez was extremely gracious to allow me up there to do that and guide the rehearsal for the proper intonation in this piece among the woodwinds especially, because boy howdy is it a wild world of woodwinds. They did an incredible job on all that. Dario, especially the first clarinet, had dozens of new fingerings to learn, and knocked it out of the park by the end of it. It worked really, really hard in such a short time, and was able to execute passages that even changed by a 12th tone up and down, and yet it was a very harmonically important 12th tone in that context. The crazy thing about it is that even though you have these fingerings as a starting point for everybody, they're going to work slightly differently on everybody's instrument. Some of them might not work, and you have to adjust. And I didn't have Henri Boque's 12th tone chart for the bass clarinet yet, so the bass clarinetist was really struggling with some of those pitches because I couldn't document everything. Right. The thing that I suggested, that I tried for a couple of those pitches, didn't work on bass clarinet, and there was no good way to get down there, so I don't actually know what he ended up doing to make that work, but he made it work in that particular spot that I'm thinking of. So yeah, woodwinds, man, crazy. It helped that I had done so much research in the year previous. They tended to trust me quite a bit more since I gave them fingerings that were obviously well-researched and well thought out, and parts that were well thought out as much as it could be in terms of like passages that were pretty okay to finger and stuff that was not otherwise impossible.
Yeah, we need to be making more repertoire as much as we can.
That's the thing, yeah. Like there's good amounts of repertoire, avant-garde repertoire that uses microtones, but people don't tend to like it. Musicians don't tend to like it very much unless they're really into that sort of thing, and it's a minority who are. In my opinion, the more something can hook into older traditions of music making, the better. And that's, you use it as a base to leap off of, rather than throwing the whole thing down the toilet and starting over.
That's how I feel too, and I also like to confuse people's categories of what that is. That's part of what I try to do as a composer, actually.
Really?
Yeah, is if something's avant-garde or it's not, then that's not really the whole story. So I try to create a situation where person A and person B are both expected to have similar taste, but upon hearing my piece, person A thinks it was too avant-garde, and person B thought it was just fine.
It's very interesting to provoke that. You're right. I got a lot of comments after my piece that, because it was put in the program notes that it was microtonal, so people read it and they were like, "Oh, good, I got to listen to that." You know, all these the typical gray hairs who go to the symphony, right? Ugh. But I got so many comments rather after that, to the effect that, "Oh wow, like this was a really interesting piece. This was really moving. Like I did not expect to feel this way after I heard it." So apparently that part of it was at least partially a success. Either that or everyone who hated it just like left and didn't tell me anything.
I think with the more repertoire we write, the more we slowly change the like bad opinion on microtonality.
Yeah, sure.
So yeah. I wanted to ask you about two other things in choir. How do you feel about leaps? Do you use leaps to get at targets? Like, if I was trying to sing, like, a major sixth, like, ba-ba, you know, for a neutral sixth, do I think, like, ba-ba, and just think a little bit down on that? Is that how you would teach, like, a hard microtonal interval that's a leap?
Leaps are way harder than steps, and I haven't used them microtonally yet, but if I did, then I would have them adjacent to an interval that was familiar. So I might resolve the neutral sixth to a minor sixth immediately, so that they have in their head the minor sixth, and then they just think of a tone that leads into it from above.
Yeah, yeah.
And we would use that strategy. Isolated leaps you would have to teach individually, and it would be hard, but you could do it if it was worth it. That's the thing, is that hard music has to be worth it. So if you could write music where that was worth it, then you would have to construct each interval with a variety of different methods and learn each interval individually as a category.
Yes. So not only does your music utilize stepwise motion so that it can be easily taught to a choir, but you're also drawing from a small set of intervals as well, right?
True, yes.
Okay.
It's quite focused. This piece, the set of the Greek enharmonic plus like a little bit of sort of normal diatonic-y stuff in addition is pretty much the entire thing for the choir.
So the Greek enharmonic scale, does that give us 7, 9, 11 chord? Because I didn't think it would, but...
It doesn't. It doesn't. But in each individual voice, a semitone split by quarter tones or quarter tone-esque intervals does relate back to the Greek enharmonic, although the voices in that case don't share a tonic.
Right. Well, that's just, wow. It's so cool to think about how you must have made this piece with all of this in mind. Because I think a lot of composers would attack it differently. I'm sure they would. A lot of composers would probably do more like Toby Twining and seek out people who, as you say, would be superhumanly inclined to tackle like the hardest thing that can be done.
We have good virtuosic repertoire, and very few people who can do it. Right. What we need is more repertoire that is a teaching piece as well as an artistic statement, you know?
Yeah. I also wanted to ask you about one more thing. Not really a teaching tool, but something that I've used to ear train 5-tone and 7-tone equal temperament is the idea of a mistuned target. So how do you feel about that? Like for 7-tone equal temperament, let's see if I get it right. Here, give me a note, and I want to see if I can sing a 7 equal scale on it.
Oh, okay, sure. Like, how about, da, like that?
Da, 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 da.
Close.
Almost. Not quite. But when I'm thinking of that, da, 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 I'm trying to think of that middle third as being in between two, and then when I get to a fourth and fifth, I'm trying to sort of mistune those sharp and flat. But in a way, you can sort of get used to 7-tone equal temperament so that you don't have to do that. What do you think about people getting used to modes that are small that have very little in common with 12-tone equal temperament? I know that's kind of a different question, but...
It's not something that compels me artistically because those types of modes don't lend themselves to hanging on to familiar structures, which is kind of my whole bag. I also recognize that could certainly be valid. Like if you immerse yourself practicing that particular mode for a certain amount of time, then you would be able to then execute something that uses that mode, just as singers, like I was saying before, kind of pick and choose between notes of the major scale, right, sing them in a different order, and then the sonorities that they land on are the sonorities that, you know, that will basically be in tune by that system.
Yeah.
So I think it's certainly a possibility. I just haven't done work with that and don't particularly intend to in the near future.
Things like the Blackwood 10 mode.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like if you selectively grab the 7 notes from that are acting diatonically at the time, that could be a really, really pedagogically helpful scale, provided you're using 7 of the notes at a time. I'm
interested in this stuff, especially because some of it has come up with regard to other sonorities that I've used, like the Ives quote-unquote major and quote-unquote minor chord, described by Miles Skinner as the A chord and the B chord,
yes,
are apparently each like one of them's like neutral 7 or neutral 4 or I don't know what, and then the other one is called something else that's cool. Paul Erlich, who is not here, notified me of those correspondences, so it's something that I have to look into, but I don't think it's going to be something that generates the tonal material that I use. I think if anything, I'll just have to explore the correspondences with the material that I'm already using, because the material that I'm using grows from familiar structures and not the other way around. I'm not looking to go from a scale that I find somehow, you know, to be interesting and zenny, and then figure out what to do with it. You know, the piece is not going to spring from the scale. The melody is going to have to be central.
Interesting. Well, it's been super revealing and insightful to sort of get into your head about this piece and hear about it and all of that, and hopefully we can play clips of it on the show. I totally understand that. We can?
No, I got permission. So in a week or so, when they have it all mixed down, then I'll send it to you, and I think I'll use 2-minute clips.
Oh wow, that's incredible.
Well, thank you so much for having me on Now and Zen. Very much appreciate it. Well, I'll be in touch.
Sweet. All right. Thanks so much.
Thank you, and I'll talk to you later.
Alrighty. Bye bye.
Bye bye.